tale, January is a 60-year-old bachelor who suddenly decides that it is time for him to settle down and take a wife. A few years into the marriage, January is cuckolded by his young wife, but he chooses to look the other way, forgiving and ignoring the act of adultery that he personally witnessed. January chooses to be ignorant in this situation, which allows him to continue his life as it has been. Unfortunately for Phoebus in the Mansfool's tale, he is not given the opportunity to play the ignorant husband. Phoebus loves his wife, but is also weary of the possibility of her being wooed into bed by another man. His unnamed wife does indeed have an affair that is witnessed by Phoebus's crow that tells Phoebus what he has seen. Since he is told about the infidelity by the crow, he cannot ignore his wife's affair. Phoebus must act, or else he will appear to be an even bigger fool to members of his society when the news is spread. However, immediately after killing his wife for the adulterous act, he regrets it and blames the messenger. The reactions of these two men beg an answer to the question, is ignorance bliss? Or more specifically, did Chaucer believe ignorance is bliss? In examining the Merchant's Tale and the Mansfool's Tale, it is easy to conclude that ignorance is bliss in Chaucer's opinion. The Oxford English Dictionary defines ignorance as want of knowledge, general or special. However, the Middle English Dictionary defines ignorance as the lack of wisdom or knowledge. The Middle English Dictionary definition best fits the meaning of the phrase, ignorance is bliss, i.e., the lack of wisdom or knowledge gives people the opportunity to be happy in their lives, which appropriately applies to January in the Merchant's Tale. The first tale examines the relationship between January and Maius. After much searching, January selects a beautiful young woman, Maius, to take as his bride. Maius's appearance sufficeth him here youth and her beauty. I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce Middle English. If Dr. Reed was here, she could help me. Maius is exactly what January wants. She is very young, no more than 20 years certain, and beautiful. Before January marries Maius, he seeks the advice of Placebo and Justinus, both of whom disagree with his plan to marry a much younger woman, and they caution him against it, assuring him that life will not be easy and that she may not be faithful due to the age difference. January responds to their negativity that he shall have his heaven and earth here, since he believes that marrying Maius will only bring happiness. He chooses to ignore his friend's advice and marries Maius, who later cheats on him in front of his own eyes. January's goal at the beginning of the tale is to marry a young, beautiful woman who he can love and by whom he can gain a legitimate heir in order for him to pass his legacy on. January even admits, after his eyesight has been gone for quite some time, that he has found the creature that he best loves. It appears, by examining the specific words used by January without applying interpretations, that he truly cares for her, even though she has not yet conceived his child. His entire life's happiness depends upon his relationship with Maius. He wanted a beautiful wife. He found one. Eventually, he recovers his sight with the help of the god Pluto, who provides him with visual confirmation of his wife's adultery, just in time for January to see Damon sweep Maius. It is one thing for a man to know that his wife is cheating on him, but a different thing altogether to see his wife being willingly taken by another man. The emotional pain that this adulterous situation causes is enough to drive any man to his breaking point. Seeing a spouse in the act of having a physical and sexual affair is something that has been known to motivate men to extreme actions in the Canterbury Tales and in today's society. In some court systems around the world, a crime of passion clause exists in murder cases and is defined by the Cambridge Dictionary as a crime committed because of very strong emotional feelings, especially in connection with a sexual relationship. Typically, crimes, specifically murder or attempted murder, committed in the heat of passion do not earn the same verdict or sentencing outcome as if the crime were premeditated. Crimes of passion are committed when there is little to no time to calm down and think rationally. January could have reacted in a manner similar to that of Phoebus and committed a crime of passion. Had he done so, his reaction would have been justified according to the legal system, but he chooses a path completely separate from anger. January verbally expresses his feelings about catching Maius and Damien, but he is able to keep his composure in light of the situation. January allows Maius's rhetorical ability to reassure him at the end of the tale that he did not see what he knows he saw. Previously in the tale, January does not listen to his friend's arguments to reconsider his marriage to Maius. However, now January is quick to allow Maius to talk him into believing that she is innocent. Because he knows the odds of him reproducing and gaining an heir with Maius are greater than the odds would be if he had to find another wife due to his old age, he not only has to ignore the infidelity, but he must ignore the fact that he was wrong about his young, beautiful wife in the first place. The OED defines the word ignore as an adjective that means not to know, to be ignorant of, which shows the connection between the word ignore and ignorance, since both words indicate a lack of knowledge. January chooses to ignore his wife's infidelity and chooses to play ignorant to the affair. He even goes so far as to place his hands on her womb and stroketh her full soft. In his choice to play ignorant, January is either expressing his continuing hope for an heir of his own, or he is expressing that he is willing to ignore the true paternity of any child that may come from Maius's union with Damian and accept the child as his own. January plays the ignorant husband in order to keep his life as he knows it. If he acknowledges Maius's infidelity, he not only gives up his hope of an heir, but he must admit he is wrong and face hearing the dreaded "I told you so's" from his friends. Prior to marrying Maius, January expressed his opinion that marriage cannot bring a man any adversity, and that marriage can only be bliss, that is between a husband and a wife. However, January quickly realizes that the bliss he previously expected does not come without a price. Therefore, he must choose ignorance. The choice of ignorance allows him to live in bliss for the remainder of his life, or at least the possibility to do so, barring any other marital complications. On the contrary, Phoebus from the Mansfield Tale is not allowed the opportunity to choose ignorance, since he acts on the news of his wife's infidelity before he has the opportunity to calm down or cool off. The crow, which believes he is doing right by his master, tells Phoebus of his wife's infidelity. Upon first sight of his master, after witnessing the affair, all the crow can say is cacao, 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 which coincidentally sounds similar to the word cuckold, and must be prompted by Phoebus to continue. The crow may or may not have ulterior motives, since he himself is in a cage, and a caged bird, like a fablio wife, will do what it can to escape. Phoebus is guilty of objectifying both his wife and his pet crow. He treats his wife and his crow the same, caging them both out of fear of losing each of them to another. Phoebus's treatment of the two important things in his life are so similar that the speaker of the tale notices and introduces them both the same and reiterates their similarity by mentioning the crow first. Now had this Phoebus in his house a crow, now had this Phoebus in his house a wife. By stating that, Phoebus had, more specifically, that he possessed a crow and a wife in his house, the speaker allows readers a brief look at Phoebus's controlling nature. These things, the crow and the wife, belong to him and lack any freedom they each desire. Confining a living thing that wishes for freedom is a recipe for disaster that is even mentioned by the narrator. But God, it wrote, there may no man embrace, and as to destroy a thing which nature hath naturally set in a creature, take any bird and put in a cage, and do all then entry in the corsage. For ever this bird will don his business to escape out of his cage, if he may, his liberty this bird doth desire. Any living creature that is confined and caged for a period of time will do whatever it can to fight against the cage and whoever put it there. The wife, though Phoebus is described in a manner that indicates he is a pleasant man, controls those around him who he loves. Phoebus keeps a close watch over his wife because he is a jealous man who fears that otherwise he will be cuckolded. The close reign he has over his wife is possibly the very reason that she rebelled against him and slept with another. Had she been given the freedom to do as she wished, she probably would not have committed adultery, especially if her husband was truly as pleasant as described by the speaker. A similar reason may apply to the crow's desire to tell his master what he witnessed. As a living creature, the crow too desires his freedom. He believes that he tells the master what he has seen, he will be trusted enough to be let out of the cage. The crow's punishment may be unwarranted, but he did bring it upon himself when the motivations for his actions rested solely on himself. Upon hearing the news of his wife's infidelity, Phoebus must react to the news since another tells him about the adultery. Being the cuckolded victim in this situation is bad enough for his reputation. He cannot afford to seem weak to others as well. According to David Rabin, Women in Chaucer's tales typically escape their trials unscathed, with only a handful of exceptions. Most emerge with self-respect and with remarkable control over their own lives and the lives of some men. However, that is not true for the wife of Phoebus, when he immediately, within 5 lines after hearing the last of what the crow has to say, exerts the ultimate punishment upon his wife and kills her with his bow and arrow. Allison from the Miller's Tale, the wife of Bath from her own prologue, and Dorigen from the Franklin's Tale all experienced difficulties in their relationships, which they themselves caused, but each of them escapes unscathed and are even better off than they were when their tales began. On the other hand, Phoebus's unnamed wife is the only female character who initiates the marital conflict and is severely punished. Chaucer may have forgone naming his character in order to limit the reader's opportunity to feel sympathy for her. She was treated as property, after all, and to allow readers the opportunity to focus on Phoebus in order to consider the motivation behind his rash actions. Phoebus's actions may seem extreme to some, but readers have to take into account the fact that Phoebus killed his wife in the heat of passion. He did not have time to think rationally and examine the situation. The tale speaker, the manciple, even notes that it was in Phoebus's ire that his wife then hath he slain. Phoebus, as a prominent member of society, commands respect from those around him and expects a certain amount of control over those in his life. Therefore, he is forced to protect his reputation before he is able to take the time to consider life without her. Not only has his wife cuckolded him, but also she has done so with one of little reputation, not worth to thee as in comparison a maintenance of a gnat. Simply put, she has had an affair with a man who is of much lower status socially and physically than Phoebus, which only adds insult to injury. Phoebus's immediate concern must be his reputation, as medieval law clearly states that if a lord's wife commits adultery with someone of significantly lower birth or worth, then both the lady and her lover are equally guilty of high treason. He must defend his reputation and his honor before anything else. Because of his station in life, society would not have responded well to an unpunished wife if the news of her adultery had been made public knowledge. Political leaders are often mocked when their citizens see them as ignorant and weak. Phoebus had no other choice but to act and punish his wife for her transgressions. Through his actions, Phoebus is also taking back the control he once had over his wife and his pet. Once he has time to reflect upon his actions, he turns on the crow. Phoebus accuses the crow of being a traitor with the tongue of a scorpion and claims that the crow is the one who brought him to confusion, not his cheating wife. He then recants his accusations against his wife and chooses to believe that the serpent is a liar, that his servant is a liar, and that he himself is too quick to anger. He chooses to believe that his wife is full guiltless and that she could not possibly have slept with another man instead of choosing to revel in his anger towards her. He chooses to go the rest of his life feeling sorrow for his actions against his wife and damning the crow for eternity by plucking the bird's white feathers, taking away its ability to speak and sing, and throwing it out the door. Phoebus chooses too late to be ignorant of his wife's infidelity in order to justify his continuing love for her, even after he knows of her adultery. For Phoebus, ignorance would have been bliss. Though these tales have 2 different endings, one in bliss and the other in personal punishment, they share the same theme. Ignorance is bliss, or at least in the eyes of Chaucer. If one is not forced by others to confront an issue, that person is able to continue living his or her life the same as before. January is able to stay blissful in his relationship with Maius and his hopes for an heir. Phoebus does not have the opportunity to stay ignorant at the time, but he chooses to punish himself in the crow rather than stay bitter towards his deceased wife. He wishes he had never heard the news in the first place. The crow and all of his offspring must suffer because he did not stop to consider how his selfish actions might affect others. Had he given Phoebus the chance to live in ignorance, he too could have had bliss. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are full of adulterous wives. However, one thing is clear. Those who know nothing of the infidelity are able to live their life in peaceful bliss, while those who learn of the infidelity are forced to face the truth and change something about their lives. Ignorance does have its benefits for some, characters and people alike. Simply not knowing can be easier than facing the difficult truth. Therefore, for many people, including Geoffrey Chaucer, ignorance is indeed bliss. Are there any questions?
I've never noticed that ignore and ignorance are the same root.
I don't think I really noticed it until I started preparing for this paper either.
Questions for Ashley?
Questions?
Do you say something about human nature that, I mean, don't we all do this in a way? We make choices to rationalize things, maybe ignore that they exist, make this alternative facts.
Yes.
But it kind of reminds me of the ending of Streetcar Named Desire when Stella refuses to believe that her husband raped her sister because to believe it would have been to give up the life that she's made.
Yeah, and it kind of goes off of the saying, oh, and now I know, it just left my head. What you don't know won't hurt you.
Right.
And so that's kind of what I was thinking.
Well, what
is
you do know and refuse to acknowledge.
Yeah, well, that too.
Very interesting.
Are we ready for the next one?
Do you need to take a break?
No, I'm okay. I'm good.
Okay, well then let's go ahead.
Okay, the next paper is titled Louisa May Alcott, Gender Stereotyping and Gender Bending. And I wrote this one almost a year ago now with Dr. Reed in our women's literature course. So we had to take one of the texts that we had read and examine it through the feminine literary lens. Louisa May Alcott was a writer during the mid to late 1800s who is most widely known for her book Little Women, which features a young charismatic girl as she ascends into womanhood. The book, turned movie, is a story of four sisters and the path that each of them take into womanhood, and was modeled after Alcott's own experiences as one of four girls. The story Little Women is what some may consider a typical novel about the struggles and life events of females written by a female. However, Alcott is not quite the typical female novelist that the story Little Women may suggest. In her short story, My Mysterious Mademoiselle, Louisa May Alcott proves that men often fit into their own gender stereotypes and can bend those stereotypes when desired. Although Alcott is typically known for her strong female characters, in My Mysterious Mademoiselle, she creates George Vane, a middle-aged narrator who fits the stereotypical male role almost exactly. George enjoys his place of privilege as controller of the gaze in a male-authored world, a position he claims at the expense of his sister. He has been estranged from his sister for more than 15 years, and after receiving a pathetic letter from his sister, George sets off to care for her in her final hours. His use of the adjective pathetic indicates rather bluntly his current feelings for his long-lost sibling. He sees her as the desperate woman who tore their family apart all those years ago. George even states that nothing would have induced him to undertake this particular trip had it not been for that pathetic letter, in which his sister stated that she had a precious gift to bestow upon him before her death. George is undertaking typical male helping, which involves heroic and chivalrous behavior. George believes he is chivalrously coming to his sister's rescue after all those years apart, and he believes this because he is the one putting his previous feelings of being mortally offended aside to appease his sister's dying request. However, his disdain and resentment toward her still lingers in his tone, which is evident in the use of the word pathetic. George sees his sister as a thing, an object, instead of a person that desperately needs him, and that he is the only one who can help. Even though George believes that he is being an upstanding brother who is going above and beyond for his sister, he is in fact the pawn of their controlling father and has allowed the words and actions of his father to determine his own. Until now, George has allowed his father to control him. His sister upset their father years ago, and George simply went along with his father's judgment instead of reaching his own conclusions about the man his sister married. George is not quite the man he believes himself to be. George spends the first part of the trip alone, but his doggish nature appears once he agrees to take pity on a charming mademoiselle by allowing her to ride in his coupe. Even though George describes her as the slender girl of 16, He becomes enchanted by her and cannot take his eyes off of her. Since the girl is much younger than he, George sees her as subservient, dependent, and vulnerable, and claims that he must take care of her. In gender studies, research shows that men attach their help to non-routine and risky acts of rescuing others, and behavior that shows courtesy and protectiveness of subordinates. George behaves in a risky manner by flirting and giving his attention to one so much his junior. However, his male ideas about help cloud the inappropriateness of his behaviors, and he truly believes he is doing the right thing by protecting her. George likely inherited his ideas of male protectiveness from societal expectations on men. Once the young girl falls asleep on the train, George observes her and resigns himself to be her protector on this journey. He notes that she is far too young and pretty to be traveling alone, and that he must take care of her. In this case, George is performing his gender. That is, he is conforming to societal expectations, skills, and beliefs consistent with male gender roles. Society has taught George that women are helpless and that it is his job and responsibility to care for this poor little thing, even though he had not had previous notions to care for his own sister. George views the mademoiselle as a thing or property, which is evident in his use of the word thing, in his description of her, and as helpless in his use of the word poor. The idea that George fits the stereotypical notions of a middle-aged male bachelor becomes even more apparent the longer he is around this young lady. George is able to look long and freely at her face, and notes that she is prettier than ever when flushed with sleep. The more innocent and young she appears to be, the more attracted to her George becomes. He is following typical male stereotypes that indicate older middle-aged men are more attracted to young women than women of their own age. George feels that he is entitled to stare at her beauty long and freely because he is a man. It is reasonable to argue that a female in a similar situation would not believe it her right to act in the same manner as George. Once the young mademoiselle becomes aware of his stare, she thinks that he has dangerous intentions towards her. George is forced to change his demeanor from a possible suitor to a man of parental air to reassure her that he is harmless. Even though George briefly changes his role from suitor to father, he is still performing his gender based on societal expectations by relying on the familiar archetype, the young, fragile female in peril, desperate for assistance from the strong and capable male. He continues acting in the parental role when he shares his meal with her and serves her as respectfully as if she had been a duchess, which is a complete contradiction to his reference of her as a pretty blonde schoolgirl. By referring to her as a duchess, George indicates that he must act in a respectful, mannerly way, while schoolgirl indicates that he can act in any manner that he pleases. However, George resorts back to playing the interested, flirtatious bachelor whenever he desires. The mademoiselle sees a man who is searching for her and requests the protection of George and asks him to play the role of her father for a moment. At her suggestion of the fatherly role, George asserts his power in the situation and refers to her as his madam when the searcher approaches the train car. He takes malicious satisfaction in disobeying the girl, for the idea of passing as her father disgusted him, even though he intentionally took on a parental role previously in the story in order to gain her trust. George uses his gender and age to force her into his fantasy of who she is and what she means to him, which allows him to assert his authority over her when she lacks the ability to object. George relies on the idea that stereotypes affect judgment of females and knows that she will not risk being caught to contradict his claim that she is his wife. George takes pleasure in acting as husband and wife for the brief time allotted them, and uses this authority to demand some reward for protecting her. Since the mademoiselle is in no position to object, she goes along with his scheme, but her secret will soon be unveiled and she will gain the power. Alcott also uses female gender stereotyping when she gender bends the portrayal of young George Vane Vandeleur as the mademoiselle in the story. By using the younger George as an embodiment of the feminine role, Alcott thereby enacts her rebellion against constricting roles and rules with wit. While pretending to be the young mademoiselle, young George pretends to be frightened of the older man after discovering that he has been watching her sleep. The young girl sprung up and, clasping her hands, cried imploringly, "Ah, Mazur, do not hurt me, for I am helpless." Young George performs his idea of female gender roles, which depend heavily on the social conditions and norms. It is his belief that women, particularly young women in his society, are helpless and must rely on true gentlemen to protect them. The elderly George already agrees with this gender stereotype, which is evident in his reaction to the pretend accusation against his moral character by becoming defensive and reassuring of his true, honorable character. Alcott proves that society believes that women must have a man to feel safe. Once again, young George proves the belief that women need men as protectors when he enlists the elder George in his scheme to hide from the man searching for him. While still in his feminine disguise, young George is almost caught by one of his teachers. Upon seeing the man searching for him, young George requests the help of the elder George to cover her up, say that she is ill, call himself her father for a moment, while giving him an imploring look that could not be ignored. The elder George is duty-bound by his gender role to act as the mademoiselle's protector, and thus helps hide her. However, he does so as her husband, not as her father as she requests. When she asks for an explanation as to the odd plea, she promises to give him anything by and by, if he will continue the charade until the searcher is gone. The mademoiselle plays on the elder George's emotions and attraction to her in order to gain the thing that she needs, a viable disguise. She counts on him, fitting the male stereotype that men are attracted to much younger women. By having the nephew George trick the uncle George by pretending to be a young mademoiselle, Alcott introduces the idea of homoeroticism into the story during a time in history when such ideas were very controversial. George Vane unknowingly flirts and makes advances toward his own nephew who is in disguise. He even demands an English goodbye or a kiss when they part ways at the end of their travels. Young George adamantly refuses this demand for good reason, but the elder George insists that he will claim his reward, and she might as well get used to the idea of kissing him. When the mademoiselle reveals her true self as a young boy, the elder George gets angry all at once. George has been made to look the fool to his nephew and all passers-by. He has been tricked into making sexual advances toward his own nephew because he believes he is a she. While Alcott's original audience for the story might have merely been amused by the turn of events that leads to this surprising revelation, a 21st century audience might ask questions about what happened between the pair during the dark hours of the night and insinuate that there was more to their night together than is told. The elder George is now facing questions about his sexuality and tries to navigate himself out of an awkward and vulnerable position. Both the younger and elder Georges play on their stereotypical views of the other in order to advance their own individual agendas. The younger George gains authority by tricking his own uncle into flirting with the young mademoiselle. Prior to the events on the train, the elder George held the power in the family situation he was soon to face. George considered himself the heroic man sweeping in to save his poor sick sister. The unnamed sister does not possess any power because of her past and her biological sex. By keeping the sister unnamed, Alcott puts an even stronger emphasis on the idea that women are not as important as their male counterparts. Furthermore, this is especially true by naming both of the male characters George, indicating the emphasis that is placed on men in society and highlighting their importance. The young George must put Uncle George in his place and retaliate for his mother's sake. Young George utterly humiliates his uncle by attaining his sexual advances while pretending to be the mademoiselle. He is able to reprimand his uncle for not caring to find him after all those years when he now has the upper hand in their conversation. Therefore, he avenges the mistreatment of his mother, gets revenge for his own suffering while being under the restraint of other aunts, and gaining the power in his newfound relationship with his uncle. Alcott's use of gender stereotyping and gender bending in My Mysterious Mademoiselle highlights the gender roles and issues present because of them in the 19th century America. In her personal life, Alcott was an active member of the feminist movement and worked for women's rights. Alcott may be surprised to find that many of the gender stereotypes that existed over a century ago are still present in today's society.